It was a quiet, unassuming neighborhood in the suburbs of Chicago, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Kids played in the streets until the streetlights came on, and front doors were often left unlocked. But for 28-year-old Emily Carter, this sense of safety would soon be shattered by a nightmare she could never have imagined. Emily had moved into her quaint two-bedroom house just 6 months prior. She loved the peace and quiet, the friendly neighbors, and the sense of community. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, which meant she spent most of her days at home, often late into the night, working on projects. Her house was her sanctuary, or so she thought. It started small, a few odd occurrences that Emily brushed off as her imagination playing tricks on her. A flicker of movement outside her window late at night, the faint sound of footsteps on her porch when she was sure no one was there, a flower pot on her front step that seemed to have been moved slightly. She told herself it was the wind, or maybe a stray cat. But deep down, a tiny seed of unease had been planted. Then came the letters. The first one arrived on a Tuesday. Emily found it tucked under her doormat when she stepped outside to grab the morning paper. It was a plain white envelope with no return address, just her name written in neat, blocky letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. "I like watching you work late at night. Your dedication is inspiring." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She glanced around her quiet street, but everything was as it should be. Neighbors leaving for work, kids waiting for the school bus. She crumpled the letter and threw it away, convincing herself it was just a prank. Maybe one of her friends was messing with her. But the seed of unease grew a little larger. The second letter came 2 days later. This time, it was slipped into her mailbox. The message was longer. "You have such a beautiful smile. I saw it yesterday when you were talking to your neighbor. You should smile more often. It lights up the whole street." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Whoever was writing these letters wasn't just watching her. They were observing her daily routines, her interactions, her habits. She started to feel like she was being followed, even in the safety of her own home. She began double-checking her locks, closing her blinds at night, and keeping her phone close at all times. The third letter was the breaking point. It was left on her car windshield, tucked under the wiper blade. The message was more disturbing than the others. "I dream about you at night. I wonder what it would be like to be inside your house, to watch you sleep. You're so peaceful when you're unaware." Emily's hands trembled as she read the words. She called the police immediately, but without any concrete evidence or a suspect, there was little they could do. They advised her to install security cameras and be vigilant. Emily followed their advice, but the letters kept coming. Each one was more detailed, more personal, more invasive. The writer knew what she wore to bed, what she ate for breakfast, even the music she listened to while she worked. Then, one night, Emily's worst fears were realized. She was working late, as usual, when she heard a faint tapping sound coming from her living room. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. She grabbed her phone and crept toward the living room, her breath shallow and uneven. As she rounded the corner, she saw it. A shadowy figure standing outside her window, peering in. Emily screamed and dropped her phone. The figure disappeared into the darkness, but the damage was done. She called the police again, and this time, they took her seriously. They searched the area, but found nothing. Emily spent the night at a friend's house, too terrified to stay home alone. The next morning, she returned to find her front door slightly ajar. Her stomach churned as she pushed it open, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. The house was eerily quiet, but something felt off. She walked slowly through the rooms, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. And then she saw it. On her kitchen table was a single red rose and a note. The message was short, but chilling. "I was inside your house last night. You looked so beautiful sleeping. Don't worry, I'll be back." Emily's world shattered. She packed a bag and left her house that same day, staying with friends while she figured out what to do. The police increased patrols in her neighborhood, but the stalker was never caught. Emily eventually sold her house and moved to a new city, but the trauma stayed with her. She never felt truly safe again. To this day, she doesn't know who the Watcher was or what they wanted. All she knows is that they were always there, lurking in the shadows, watching her every move. And sometimes, late at night, she still feels their presence, a ghostly reminder of the horror she endured. In a small, fog-drenched town nestled in the Pacific Northwest, 24-year-old Clara Bennett lived alone in an old, creaky house at the edge of the woods. The house had been in her family for generations, passed down to her after her grandmother's passing. It was a beautiful but eerie place, with its antique furniture, peeling wallpaper, and a large, ornate mirror that hung in the hallway. Clara had always felt a strange energy in the house, but she chalked it up to its age and history. That was, until the nightmares began. It started with the dreams. Clara would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, convinced that someone was in her room. In her dreams, she'd see a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed, watching her silently. She could never make out their face, but she could feel their presence, cold, menacing, and unnervingly real. At first, she told herself it was just stress or her overactive imagination. But then, the dreams began to bleed into her waking life. One night, Clara was brushing her teeth in the bathroom when she heard a faint whisper behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. She shook it off, telling herself it was just the wind or the old pipes. But as she turned back to the mirror, her blood ran cold. For a split second, she saw someone standing behind her in the reflection. A tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. She screamed and stumbled backward, but when she looked again, the figure was gone. From that night on, Clara began to notice strange things happening around the house. Doors would creak open on their own. The temperature in certain rooms would drop suddenly, sending chills down her spine. And always, she felt like she was being watched. But the worst was the mirror. Every time she passed it, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something or someone was waiting for her on the other side. One evening, Clara decided to confront her fears. She stood in front of the mirror, staring into her own reflection, and demanded, "Who are you? What do you want?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, her reflection began to change. Her face twisted into a grotesque smile, her eyes darkened, and a voice that wasn't hers whispered, "I've been waiting for you." Clara stumbled back, her heart pounding. She grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, vowing never to look into it again. But the presence in the house only grew stronger. She began to hear footsteps in the hallway at night, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing outside her door. She'd wake up to find her belongings moved or rearranged, as if someone had been rifling through them while she slept. And then there were the whispers, soft, insidious, and always just out of earshot. Desperate for answers, Clara began researching the history of the house. She spent hours in the local library, poring over old newspapers and records. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Decades ago, a man named Elias Grayson had lived in the house. He was a reclusive artist who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. According to the townsfolk, Elias had become obsessed with a mirror he claimed was a portal to another world. He would spend hours staring into it, muttering to himself, until one day he vanished without a trace. The mirror was the same one that now hung in Clara's hallway. Clara knew she had to get rid of the mirror. She tried to take it down, but it was as if it was fused to the wall. She tried to smash it, but the glass wouldn't break, no matter how hard she hit it. It was as if the mirror was alive, resisting her every attempt to destroy it. And then, one night, the unthinkable happened. Clara woke up to the sound of her own voice calling her name. She sat up in bed, her heart racing, and realized the voice was coming from the hallway. She grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the sound, her hands trembling. As she approached the mirror, she saw her reflection staring back at her, but it wasn't her. The figure in the mirror had her face, but its eyes were black voids, and its smile was twisted and cruel. It reached out a hand and, to Clara's horror, the hand began to emerge from the mirror, stretching into the real world. Clara screamed and stumbled backward, but the figure kept coming. It stepped out of the mirror, its movements jerky and unnatural, and advanced toward her. Clara turned and ran, but the house seemed to shift and change around her, the walls closing in, the doors slamming shut. She was trapped. The figure caught up to her in the living room. It grabbed her by the shoulders, its grip icy and unrelenting, and whispered, "You're mine now." Clara fought with everything she had, but it was no use. The figure dragged her toward the mirror, and as they crossed the threshold, Clara felt a searing pain, as if her very soul was being ripped apart. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in her house. She was in a dark, twisted version of it, where the walls pulsed like living flesh and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The figure stood before her, its smile widening. "Welcome to my world," it said. Clara tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was trapped in this nightmare realm, with no way to escape. And as the days turned into weeks, she began to change. Her reflection in the mirror became distorted, her eyes darkened, and her smile twisted into something inhuman. She realized, too late, that the figure had been waiting for a new host, someone to take its place in the mirror while it walked free in the real world. Back in Clara's house, the mirror hung silently in the hallway, and if you were to look into it, you might see Clara's face staring back at you, her eyes pleading for help. But be careful, because if you look too long, you might just find yourself on the other side. In a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood in upstate New York, 32-year-old Rachel Evans lived a peaceful life with her husband, Mark, and their 6-year-old daughter, Lily. Their home was a charming 2-story house with a white picket fence and a sprawling backyard. It was the kind of place where families thrived and neighbors waved to each other from their porches. But Rachel's idyllic life was about to be shattered by a horror she could never have imagined. It all began when their next-door neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Grayson, passed away. He had lived alone for years, and though he kept to himself, he was always kind to Rachel's family, often waving to Lily when she played in the yard. When he died, Rachel felt a pang of sadness, but life went on. The house sat empty for months, its windows dark and its yard overgrown. And then, one day, a moving truck arrived. The new neighbors were a young couple, Sarah and Tom, who seemed friendly enough. They introduced themselves to Rachel and Mark, and Lily quickly took a liking to Sarah, who often brought her cookies. But something about them felt off. Rachel couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was an unease that lingered whenever she was around them. She told herself she was being paranoid, but the feeling only grew stronger. The first sign that something was wrong came one night when Rachel was putting Lily to bed. As she tucked her daughter in, Lily looked up at her with wide, fearful eyes and said, "Mommy, I don't like the man in my closet." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She opened the closet door, but it was empty. She reassured Lily that it was just a bad dream, but the look in her daughter's eyes stayed with her. A few nights later, Rachel woke up to the sound of Lily screaming. She bolted out of bed and ran to her daughter's room, where she found Lily sitting up in bed, trembling and pointing at the window. He was there, Mommy, the man with the scary face. Rachel looked out the window, but all she saw was the dark silhouette of the neighbor's house. She held Lily until she fell back asleep, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The incidents grew more frequent and more disturbing. Lily began talking about an imaginary friend named Mr. Grayson, who she said lived in the neighbor's house. Rachel tried to dismiss it as a child's overactive imagination, but the details Lily provided were too specific. She described Mr. Grayson's wrinkled face, his kind smile, and the way he always wore a flannel shirt. Details that matched the elderly man who had lived next door. But Mr. Grayson was dead. Rachel had attended his funeral. One evening, Rachel was in the kitchen when she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Sarah standing on the porch, holding a plate of cookies. "I just wanted to thank you for being such great neighbors," Sarah said with a smile. Rachel forced a smile in return, but as she took the plate, she noticed something strange. Sarah's hands were cold, unnaturally cold, as if she had been standing in a freezer, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. That night, Rachel decided to investigate. She waited until Mark and Lily were asleep, then grabbed a flashlight and crept into the backyard. The neighbor's house was dark, but as she approached, she noticed something odd. The windows were covered from the inside with thick black curtains, and the air around the house felt heavy, almost suffocating. Rachel's heart pounded as she stepped onto the porch and peered through a crack in the curtains. What she saw made her blood run cold. Inside, the house was a shrine to Mr. Grayson. The walls were covered in photographs of him, some dating back decades. Candles flickered on every surface, casting eerie shadows across the room. And in the center of it all was a life-sized mannequin dressed in Mr. Grayson's clothes, its face eerily lifelike. Rachel stumbled back, her mind racing. Who were Sarah and Tom, and why were they obsessed with a dead man? Before she could process what she had seen, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. Rachel spun around to find Sarah standing behind her, her face twisted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't be here," Sarah hissed. Rachel tried to scream, but no sound came out. Sarah's grip tightened, and everything went black. When Rachel woke up, she was lying in her own bed, the morning sun streaming through the windows. She tried to convince herself it had all been a nightmare, but the bruises on her shoulder told a different story. She decided to confront Sarah and Tom, but when she went next door, the house was empty. The moving truck was gone and the yard was overgrown once again. It was as if they had never existed. Rachel thought it was over, but the nightmare was just beginning. That night, she woke up to the sound of Lily giggling. She followed the sound to her daughter's room, where she found Lily sitting on the floor, talking to someone Rachel couldn't see. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. Lily looked up at her with a smile and said, "Mr. Grayson. He says he's never leaving." Rachel's heart stopped. She grabbed Lily and ran out of the room, but as she passed the hallway mirror, she saw him. Mr. Grayson was standing behind her, his face twisted into a cruel smile. He reached out a hand, and Rachel felt an icy grip on her shoulder. She screamed, but when she turned around, there was no one there. From that day on, Rachel's life became a living nightmare. Lily's imaginary friend grew more real, more menacing. Rachel would hear footsteps in the hallway at night, and the temperature in the house would drop without warning. And always, always, she felt Mr. Grayson's presence, watching her, waiting for her. One night, Rachel woke up to find Lily's bed empty. She searched the house in a panic, calling her daughter's name, but there was no response. And then she heard it, a faint giggle coming from the neighbor's house. Rachel ran outside, her heart pounding, and burst through the front door. What she saw made her blood run cold. Lily was sitting on the floor, surrounded by candles, talking to Mr. Grayson. But he wasn't a mannequin or a ghost. He was real. His wrinkled face twisted into a smile as he reached out a hand to Lily. Rachel screamed and grabbed her daughter, but as she turned to leave, Mr. Grayson's voice echoed through the house. "You can't escape me. I'll always be here." Rachel moved her family out of the house the next day, but the nightmare didn't end. No matter where they went, Mr. Grayson followed. Lily still talked to him, and Rachel still felt his icy grip on her shoulder. She realized too late that he had never really left. He had been waiting for a new family to move in, a new life to torment. And now, he was a part of theirs. And there you have it. 3 bone-chilling stories of stalkers, shadows, and the horrors that lurk just out of sight. These tales are a stark reminder that danger can hide in the most ordinary places, in the reflection of a mirror, in the house next door, or even in the letters left at your doorstep. The world is full of mysteries, and sometimes the most terrifying ones are closer than we think. If these stories sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying content. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a video, because the next story might just keep you up at night. Stay safe, stay aware, and always trust your instincts. Because in the end, the scariest monsters are the ones we never see coming. Until next time, sleep with one eye open.